Just in, an emergency session is underway behind closed doors on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers from both parties have gathered for urgent discussions regarding former President Donald Trump. These conversations, according to multiple sources familiar with the proceedings, were not scheduled. They were called suddenly. Emergency Senate sessions don't happen often. When they do, something significant is building beneath the surface. Right now, senators are weighing a decision that could reshape the political landscape for years to come. The details are still emerging, but what we know suggests this isn't routine political theater. This is institutional pressure finding its release point. In politics, as in markets, timing reveals everything. When institutions move this fast, it's usually because pressure is building somewhere behind the scenes, something that can't wait, something that demands immediate attention. The question isn't just what decision they'll make. The question is what happens after, because decisions made under pressure tend to have consequences that ripple far beyond the room where they're made. What you're about to hear is an analysis of what led to this moment, what's at stake, and why one decision in the coming hours could change the trajectory of American politics. This is not speculation. This is what we know and what we can reasonably infer from the patterns unfolding right now. To understand why senators are meeting right now, you have to go back several weeks. Legal proceedings have been accelerating. Multiple cases involving Trump have reached critical junctures. Deadlines have passed, motions have been filed, and the machinery of the justice system has been moving forward regardless of political noise. According to court documents and legal analysts, certain decisions were due. Prosecutors were preparing next steps. Defense teams were positioning their responses. And then something shifted. Reports began emerging that discussions were happening at the highest levels of government. Conversations between Justice Department officials, congressional leadership, and legal experts. Not public, not announced, but happening nonetheless. The catalyst appears to be a combination of factors. First, timing. Several legal matters are converging at once. This isn't one isolated case. This is multiple proceedings, reaching decision points simultaneously. When systems face multiple pressures at the same time they strain, institutions are forced to choose priorities. Second, political context. We're heading into a critical period on the political calendar. Elections have consequences. So does proximity to them. The closer we get to major political events, the more sensitive institutional decisions become. Third, public pressure. Polling data suggests the American public is divided but also exhausted. There's a growing sense that something needs to resolve. Not in favor of one side or another, just resolve, clarity, direction. These three forces, legal timing, political context, and public sentiment, created the conditions for this emergency session. Lawmakers indicate that the discussions focus on institutional response. How does the Senate position itself? What role, if any, should it play? And what precedent does silence set versus action? Sources familiar with the talk say the mood is serious, not performative. These aren't speeches for cameras. These are closed-door conversations about consequences. One senator, speaking on condition of anonymity, told reporters, "We're not here to make noise. We're here because decisions are coming, whether we're ready or not." That's the environment right now. Pressure building, decisions pending, and institutions trying to navigate without precedent as their guide inside. The chamber, the atmosphere is described as tense but controlled. This isn't the kind of tension you see on cable news. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations. This is the quiet tension of people who understand the weight of their choices. According to multiple reports, senators have been divided, not along typical party lines, but along different fault lines entirely. Some believe the institution should remain separate from ongoing legal processes. Let the courts handle their business. Stay out of it. Others argue that remaining silent is itself a choice with consequences. They believe the Senate has a constitutional role to play, especially when questions of accountability and precedent are at stake. A third group appears focused on timing, not whether to act, but when. They're calculating what happens if they move too early versus too late. Both carry risks. Sources familiar with the discussion say leadership has been working to find common ground. But common ground is hard to locate when the landscape itself is shifting. One detail stands out. The meeting was called with very little notice. That suggests urgency. Institutions don't convene emergency sessions on a whim. Something accelerated the timeline. Legal analysts say this could be tied to upcoming court deadlines. If judges are about to issue rulings, senators may want to establish their position before those rulings become public. Reactive positioning is always weaker than proactive positioning. There's also the question of leverage. Right now, uncertainty gives lawmakers some degree of influence. Once outcomes become clear, that leverage disappears. Timing isn't just about optics, it's about maintaining optionality. What's notable is who's in the room. This isn't just leadership. This includes members of key committees, judiciary, intelligence, ethics. The fact that these senators were called suggests the scope of discussion goes beyond politics. This touches on institutional integrity. One senior aide described the mood as focused. No leaks, no grandstanding, just quiet, serious conversation about what comes next. That kind of discipline is rare. When it appears, it usually means the stakes are understood by everyone involved. Donald Trump is no stranger to pressure. Over the past several years, he's faced investigations, indictments, court proceedings, and political opposition from multiple directions. His response has been consistent. Deny wrongdoing, attack the process, and rally his base. According to those familiar with his legal strategy, Trump's team is preparing for multiple scenarios. They're not betting on one outcome. They're building optionality into every move. Legally, his attorneys are pursuing every available appeal and delay. That's standard practice in complex cases. But it's also strategic. Time creates opportunity. New evidence emerges. Political conditions change. Public attention shifts. Politically, Trump has positioned himself as a target of institutional overreach. He frames every legal challenge as political persecution. Whether you agree with that framing or not, it's effective with his supporters. It transforms legal proceedings into political battles. Right now, Trump's leverage comes from uncertainty. As long as outcomes remain unclear, he retains influence. The moment decisions are finalized, whether in his favor or not, that influence shifts. Sources close to his campaign say he's watching these Senate talks closely, not because he expects intervention, but because institutional positioning matters. How the Senate responds or doesn't respond shapes the narrative. Trump understands something fundamental about power. It's not just about winning or losing individual battles. It's about controlling the story around those battles. And stories are shaped by how institutions react under pressure. His risk right now is twofold. First, legal outcomes could narrow his options significantly. If courts rule against him decisively, his political positioning becomes harder to maintain. Second, institutional consensus could form against him. Right now, there's division. Division creates space. If institutions align even quietly, that space closes. But Trump also has advantages. He has a loyal base, he has fundraising capacity, and he has demonstrated an ability to survive crises that would have ended other political careers. In long-term thinking, you don't evaluate positions based on current conditions alone. You evaluate them based on how conditions might evolve. Trump's position today is uncertain, but uncertainty cuts both ways. It's risk and it's opportunity. What matters most isn't his current position. It's how he responds when pressure reveals which way institutions are leaning. Character and strategy both show up clearest when the stakes are highest. Here's why this matters beyond the immediate political moment. Institutions operate on precedent. What they do today becomes the template for tomorrow. When the Senate convenes an emergency session about one individual, regardless of who that individual is, it sets expectations for how similar situations will be handled in the future. If the Senate decides to take a position, it establishes that legislative bodies can and should weigh in on matters involving former presidents facing legal accountability. That's a significant shift in institutional norms. If the Senate decides to remain silent, it establishes that such matters belong exclusively within the judicial system, free from legislative influence. That's also a significant choice. Silence isn't neutral. Silence is a decision. Both paths have consequences. Consider what happens to public trust. Right now, confidence in institutions is fragile. People want to believe that rules apply equally, that accountability exists regardless of position or power. If institutions appear to avoid difficult decisions, trust erodes further. But if institutions appear to politicize legal processes, trust erodes differently, but just as completely. This is the tightrope. Act and risk accusations of political interference. Don't act and risk accusations of enabling impunity. Now consider markets and stability. Financial markets don't like uncertainty. They can handle bad news, they can handle good news. What they struggle with is prolonged ambiguity about fundamental rules and institutional stability. Political instability translates into economic caution. Investment decisions get delayed. Hiring slows. Capital waits on the sidelines, not because of any specific policy, but because the baseline assumptions about how institutions function become unclear. This Senate decision, whatever it is, will be read as a signal, not just about Trump, but about how American institutions handle pressure, how they balance competing values, how they navigate moments when every choice carries costs. There's also the international dimension. Allies and adversaries watch how democracies function under stress. They draw conclusions about reliability, consistency, and institutional strength. These conclusions shape everything from trade negotiations to security commitments. Think of it like fault lines in geology. Most of the time you don't notice them, but when pressure builds, those fault lines determine where and how the ground shifts. This decision sits on one of those fault lines. The immediate outcome matters, but the precedent matters more, because years from now, when another situation arises and people will look back at this moment, they'll ask, what did institutions do when it mattered? Did they act with principle? Did they protect their independence? Did they balance accountability with fairness? Those questions don't have easy answers, but they have lasting consequences. This isn't just about one person or one case. This is about how power, accountability, and institutional integrity interact when tested. So what happens now? There are several possible paths forward, none of them simple. First scenario, the Senate issues a formal statement. Not a binding resolution, just a position, something that establishes institutional perspective without overstepping into judicial matters. This would be cautious, measured, and it would put lawmakers on record without forcing immediate action. Legal analysts suggest this is the most likely outcome if senators wanted to balance responsibility with restraint. A statement signals awareness without interference. It preserves institutional dignity while respecting judicial independence. Second scenario, the Senate does nothing publicly but shifts priorities behind the scenes. This would mean private conversations with Justice Department officials, quiet coordination on oversight responsibilities, and preparation for whatever legal outcomes emerge. No headlines, just repositioning. This approach has advantages. It avoids public controversy while maintaining institutional options, but it also risks appearing passive at a moment when clarity is needed. Third scenario, the Senate takes formal action, perhaps through committees, perhaps through resolutions that carry actual weight. This would be rare and controversial, but it's possible if senators conclude that institutional responsibility demands more than words. Constitutional experts note that the Senate has broad authority when it comes to oversight and accountability. Whether that authority should be exercised is a different question than whether it can be short-term expect statements from leadership. Regardless of which path they choose, they'll want to shape the narrative, control the message, avoid surprises. Medium-term, watch for how this affects ongoing legal proceedings. Judges pay attention to institutional positioning, not because it changes legal standards, but because it provides context for the environment in which their decisions will be received. Long-term, this moment becomes part of the historical record. It gets studied in law schools and political science programs. It becomes reference material for future constitutional debates. One thing appears certain, this won't resolve quickly. Whatever decision emerges from these emergency talks will be the beginning of something, not the end. Political observers note that both parties are thinking beyond the immediate moment. They're calculating how their positions today will be viewed in future elections, how their base will respond, how independents will interpret their actions. That's the nature of high-stakes decisions. They're never just about the present. They're always about trajectory. The pressure is real, the consequences are real, and the clock is moving. What senators decide in the next few hours could echo for years. Let's step back for a moment. In times of intense pressure, it's easy to get lost in immediate reactions, to focus on headlines instead of fundamentals, to mistake noise for signal. But institutions don't turn on noise. They turn on decisions made when the room is quiet and the pressure is highest. What we're witnessing right now is an inflection point, not because of any single person, but because of how multiple forces, legal, political, institutional, are converging at once. The outcome matters, but so does the process. How decisions get made reveals as much as what those decisions are. History suggests that moments like this define institutions more than the institutions define the mom. When tested organizations and systems show what they're really made of, not through their principles in calm times, but through their choices under stress, there's wisdom in understanding that you only discover what something is truly made of when pressure is applied. When conditions are favorable, everything looks strong. But when the tide goes out, you see what was built on solid ground and what wasn't. Right now, the tide is going out on multiple institutions simultaneously. We're about to find out what they're made of. The Senate talks happening today aren't just about Trump. They're about accountability, precedent, constitutional balance, the relationship between law and politics, the question of how democracies handle powerful individuals who challenge institutional norms. These are not simple questions. They don't have simple answers, but they demand thoughtful, principled responses. Because whatever happens next will be studied, debated, and referenced for decades. The best decisions aren't always the most popular, and the right path isn't always the clearest. But institutions earn their legitimacy by making hard choices for the right reasons, not for short-term advantage, not for political convenience, but because integrity demands it. We'll know soon what senators decided, whether they chose action or restraint, whether they prioritized precedent or prudence. Whatever they choose, the consequences will unfold slowly, not in days or weeks, but in years, in how future situations get handled, in whether trust in institutions strengthens or continues to erode. This is a defining moment, not because of drama, but because of what it reveals about how our systems function. When tested, pay attention, not to the noise, but to the decisions. And remember, history doesn't turn on shouting. It turns on choices made in quiet rooms by people who understand the weight of our responsibility. What happens next will matter more than most people realize right now.